Welcome, everybody, to the Dolores Project. This is another installment, and today we have a very special guest as we talk about philosophy, life, technology, and of course, AI. My guest today is Kathleen Richardson. She is the professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI at De Montfort University. If I'm saying that correctly, Kathleen. Kathleen, welcome to the
Yes.
show.
Hi, Joshua. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on, Kathleen. I've followed your work for quite a while, and we've talked in the past, and you've been very busy with all the things that you've got going on. So I'm just grateful for your time.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be here.
Yeah. So Kathleen, why don't you tell us a little bit about your particular research and how you got into the messy field of ethics and robots and AI. And a little bit later, we'll talk about some of your published work and works that are going to be published. But let's just get to know you a little bit, Kathleen. How did you get into this discussion?
Okay, so I was I was at Cambridge and I was doing a master's by research in social anthropology. And at that time, I was really interested in the ways that we understand people's relationship with the natural environment or with objects. And so my plan initially was how I could think about this in relation to perhaps environmental projects or the way indigenous people might, have different, if you like, ontologies or cosmologies about their relationships with the natural world. So that was so my master's thesis at that time was actually in environmentalism, in Amazonian perspectives on environmentalism. And but the theme was what was people's relationship with non-human entities. And and I remember I was waiting for my PhD, my results, my master's to see whether I'd been accepted onto the PhD program. And the results weren't ready. So I went to the cinema and I watched this film called AI, Artificial Intelligence. And the film was about a robot, and it was a robot shaped like a child. And the film explored, would people start to treat an object differently if it looked a particular kind of way? So if it was anthropomorphized as a child. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking, actually, all the issues that I'm really interested in about people, their relationships with the world around them, how they personify objects, what is actually going on when people do that is actually I could do this in relation to robots. So the next day I went back and I found that I'd been accepted onto the PhD program. And then I went to my supervisor and I said, I don't want to study environmental projects anymore. I want to study robots. And then that's where it began, really. And actually, there is a lot of people, when they talk about their interest in robots, it comes from some kind of, I don't know, science fiction interest. But mine never came from a science fiction interest. I think mine always came from this more humanistic impulse that I have to understand our uniqueness as human beings. And I'm not saying our uniqueness as, I mean, all living beings are unique as it happens, but that we're unique and different from objects or property and how we conceptualize that and make sense of it. So I've always been, even before I ever did a PhD, was always very politically interested in that question about people and property.
Yes, I mean
Mm.
that's a great introduction into this conversation as we talk about Steven Spielberg's film AI, which I think is a fascinating film to transition into the field because you have the dealing with sexuality and the use of labor robots, the use of companionship, and even David's own story about wanting to be with his mother. And there's something just very emotional and deep about his desire and longing for that connection. And even the teddy bear as a robot, I thought was really, really interesting to touch on just this very low level consumer friendship robot. And they all have this different part to play in society. But Kathleen, your research led you into some different areas. And one of those areas is related to sexuality. And this is a very big controversial topic. But my question is, how did you get from your PhD work there in AI to where you are starting the campaign against sex robots or porn robots? I can't remember
Yes.
which, yeah,
Uh,
as you
I'll,
changed it.
I'll, I'll explain why I changed the name.
Yeah.
So when I, as part of my field work for my PhD, I went to labs and I studied people who made robots and the kind of ideas that went into them, if you like. So what kind of models of humanity or sociality or relationality that they used. And and then after that, after I completed my PhD, I did further projects looking at therapeutic robots. So this idea that you can transfer some of the skills perhaps of a therapist into an object, and then the object can become like a proxy therapist or even a good enough therapist. And I looked at issues around autism. And the reason why I was drawn towards autism was there is a couple of reasons. One is that when I was in labs in America, during my field work, they'd already began to make these analogies between what it might be like to be a machine and what it might be like to be on the autism spectrum. Which, looking back, s- I can see there are problems with making those kind of analogies between people and machines, which I never fully understood then, but I think now I would be cautious of that
Mm,
approach. And then there was also this idea that there are some people among us that just don't have sociality, right? They're
mm,
asocial, they lack socialness. And so there's this curious conversation going on in society that somehow we can personify and turn our turn our technologies into social entities, while at the same time we have this exist that we have some human beings that are kind of asocial or lack sociality. And so my primary interest through all this was, what does it mean to be human? What is unique about being human? What is it that can't be transferred to a machine? Or can everything be transferred to machines? I mean, I didn't really know at this stage whether they could or not, but I was really grappling with this idea of relationships through all this work, and didn't feel that academia then nor now was actually very helpful, because there's a lot of theories in academia today that actually they're very anti-humanistic, in
hmm,
fact, I would say, and they don't kind of focus on the uniqueness of relationship for human beings. Why? And it's not just human beings. In my second book, I describe it as a species specific sociality. So every species, right, requires its own species for its life existence. And it may not need their own species for their permanent existence, i.e., you can have a cat that exists outside of life with other cats, but it
mm,
can't exist outside a species, this its own species. It can't be born, for example. It can't be a product of nothing
mm,
in that sense. So all species have a species specific sociality, and species are really good at providing for what a species needs and wants. And we can, particularly with living beings, and I'm talking here as a species in terms of living beings. I'm not talking about species of robots or species of computer programs.
right.
I'm very careful here that I'm only speaking about living beings. Yeah. And I couldn't find any academic theories that were willing to kind of put this forward, not in my own field of social anthropology that was dominated by works like Donna Haraway's Cyborgs,
Mm,
queer theory, actor network theory. All these theories kind of rejected the humanistic element in relationships as far as I could see. So then I began looking outside these areas into the field of attachment theory. And I think for me, in that journey, I discovered some theories where actually the importance of being with each other is 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 emphasized, right? And it's not, if you like, interchangeable with an object that looks like us or performs certain functions of a human being, like a
Mhm.
proxy. So attachment theory is one of them. And then later I came across the work of Martin Buber, dialogical phenomenology, and he's also theorizing about this between, he frames it as what's between I and you. There's like love, for example. Love exists between I and you. It doesn't actually exist anywhere else. People can externalize the idea of love. So, yesterday we had Valentine's Day. You can externalize it. You can create entities in the world that, if you like, may represent your idea of love. But love exists between the I and you. And then the I and you in each person's life is going to be different, right? And it's something that's between people. So love actually can't even exist just in one party and not in the other. It kind of there has to be something between them for it to exist. And yeah, so when it came, so I was observing all these things going on, all these back and forths between machines and people being like machines, and autism as a type of, you know, machine like state. And I was becoming more concerned by what was occurring. And then I came across this new fascination with, at the time, called sex robots. And I inherited that term. So it wasn't a term I use now, but I inherited it because that was the term at the time. And when I launched the campaign against sex robots back in 2015, it was really as an intervention to stop this idea that people can have relationships with objects. That was it, basically, with technologies, that you could meaningfully insert these objects into people's lives and it was harmless or it was better than nothing. In fact, I think it's extremely dangerous and extremely harmful to human beings that these technologies are being, if you like, peddled in this way to people. And then through that work, actually, then I started to understand more about the radical feminist positions about women as property, particular kinds of sexual property. So the radical feminism has a range of theories that explain women's place within prostitution and pornography, and as an outcome of unequal sexual relations. And so these industries don't persist as an outcome of like individual libertarian men and women choosing these practices, but they're actually part of the way in which society is organized that reinforces male superiority and female subordination.
Mm.
And what they do is they allow men to access female bodies in ways that they wouldn't be permitted to access under the civil contract of, negotiation and mutuality.
Mm.
So yeah, that's where it all came from. It came from a commitment to relationship between people, really. That's where it started from. But by choosing that topic, I was able to understand how relationship is objectified, if you like, depersonalized through the prostitution industries, pornography industry,
Mm.
and through child abuse industries.
Now, that's a lot there, Kathleen, to unpack. And there's several things that you mentioned that I think are really important that we need to delve deeper into, not necessarily today in this episode, but well, I think we'll see traced throughout the next century of our relationship with objects and artificial entities. And that is, what does it mean to be human? This question keeps coming up. And Kathleen, I come from a theological background where that question is so deeply ingrained into every other question that we ask as theologians and philosophers is we start there so many times. And for us, it's that uniqueness is derivative of the uniqueness and person of God, and that it's not necessarily an ontological property or a set of properties or abilities or anything like that, but it is an image that we are reflecting. And I think what's so fascinating about that related to dealing with sex technology and robotics is like you say that we are making entities in the image of men and women, biological men and women, to make them essentially a slave for one particular purpose, and that is the gratification of one particular sex. Mostly males, I think, consume these. I know there are female, there are ones that are geared towards female usage, but that's not quite the same for them. It's a little bit different as far as what they are looking for. Then there's companionship. We have people like Dave Cat and others who consider themselves idolaters and, married to these entities. And so that's another challenge as related to how can we be in a meaningful relationship. And I guess according to your definition of love, that it is a reciprocal process endeavor that's not really possible for them. So I think that's fascinating. Kathleen, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you think makes us unique as a human being. What is there a particular idea, property? Is it the soul? I mean, where do you land when you think about what makes us unique?
Yeah. So so I don't take a religious perspective, and so I my perspective on, I mean, the whole question, what makes us human, is kind of, in a way, it's a male question. It's like you've just said there, it's rooted in the kind of Enlightenment tradition to kind of figure out human uniqueness as a set of properties. And it was quite interesting what you said there about a reflection and image, because we're going to come to images soon when I explain about porn robots. So I am actually, it's more concrete than that. So, attachment theory, and we're always developing a language around this because it's actually very complicated to explain. But I think attachment theory explains this really well. So, when we are born, we are not born, we can't speak, we can't eat. Sorry, we can't walk, we can't speak. We are entirely dependent on our caregiver, usually the mother in the
Hmm.
world, the mother that normally looks after the children. And because of this, we are born vulnerable. And in our vulnerability, we form relationship with someone who has more power than us. And through their love and kindness, we get support. So as infants and children, we can't meet our own needs. So we need need the mother, or and the father, or if somebody else can play that role. Not and it has to be a discrete number of people. It can't be undifferentiated because it wouldn't work. You need to have that comfort and security through the attachment. And through that, the child develops a sense of themselves and is able to, after a while, start to meet their own needs. And
Hmm.
that's attachment. Now, you can have a bad attachment, right? So you could have terrible mother and terrible father who don't look after you at all, and don't provide everything that you need. And you kind of struggle with your own resources to survive. And you will survive, but, you know, without that kind of safe and secure attachment, you will have certain difficulties with forming relationships later on in life. And sometimes it's so disordered for children, they suffer severe abuse, trauma, often by people who are meant to care for them, that they struggle with many issues through their lives. I mean, they can often meet some of their functional needs, i.e., they can dress themselves and even go out to work, but they might not always be able to meet their own emotional needs. So, actually, we are in relationship from the moment we're born, and love, I think, arises through that vulnerability of relationship with someone. Love is vulnerability in between the you and I in a relationship. However, because we all need love as human beings, we will search for it and seek it, and we will create it if it doesn't exist, right? And I think, which is why you have a lot of narratives about unrequited love. And actually, there are some very harmful ideas about love out there. Like romantic love is extraordinarily harmful in when you think about it. It's this idea that against all odds, even if someone turns you down and says no to you, that you're still going to pursue them because you feel love. And if they're not responding to you with love, then it's because you've not proved yourself. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinarily damaging. And I don't think that's based on the idea of vulnerability and love at all. I think that's more based on this very egocentric notion
Mm,
of what love is. So if you feel something, then the other person must feel it. But that is actually, that's not love. Love is a relationship. Love is mutuality. Love is I and thou. Love is responding to the other, having empathy, listening, recognizing them. So I guess when we have a situation where someone comes along and says, I'm really in love with my object, then if we believe that, we can say that love actually exists outside of an other, right? And that's actually not true, because in order to survive, you've got to have some kind of attachment process. And even within those relationships where people say they are in love with the Eiffel Tower or whatever, they can't actually resource any of those feelings from objects. All those resource feelings that they're experiencing come from their relations with other people, right? That's what attachment theory would say. But they become projected onto the things. People don't generate feelings for objects. People generate feelings with each other, which then, if you like, can be imagined with objects, but they don't exist there. So this is one of the ironies of all these roboticists and technologists creating relational objects. They're saying, I mean, they're adults for one, so they've completely neglected the fact that they only exist in the world because of their attachment, because when they were born, someone fed them and changed their nappy
yeah.
and put them to bed. Because they've kind of basically decided that none of that is important. And so from their adult state, they have cultivated a sense of relationship that actually doesn't incorporate that origin story into their own understanding of relationships. And that's why you can have these very distorted adult ideas about what relationships are,
Mm,
that they can be with things or with representational objects or with robots or with dolls.
yeah. There's a lot there to unpack, but especially with, as you're saying, how we interpret the narrative, I think that's something, and I think some of what you're saying about the relational view, it also is tied into some of the different theories. If you're familiar with Karl Barth, his ideas about the relational view of the image of God, you might find some similarities between what you're saying there and the idea of love, or at least one particular idea of love and vulnerability between the I and thou. And I think there's definitely room for that. And also, Kathleen, like you're saying, the anthropology within a lot of robotics and futurism is quite thin, as I've explored and have explored, and others, and particularly those anthropologies when they come from a male vision. I find that they are quite individualistic, egotistic, and there's a lot of quietism about the wider world and what happens. And like you're saying, and so if we could dive into that for a moment, and your concerns more specifically as it relates to pornography, the porn industry, sex robots, and what's happened. And this has been going on for a long time, as we both know, but the way that the world works now is sort of a spectacle, and when things hit the news, they become of interest for a brief moment. And one of those recently was AI generated pornography. And I would just like for you to kind of give your insights on that, and even if we just want to start with pornography in general and then kind of move towards some different perspectives about how AI pornography might be different as it's generated, whether or not it's harmful. And I have my own particular views, but I'm here to listen to you, Kathleen, and your expertise. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'd recommend everyone read Pornography and Civil Rights by Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. It revolutionized my understanding of pornography. I'm afraid I was raised in an era where everyone thought pornography was great stuff and free speech, and everyone was having a great time. And actually, these feminists really early on were saying, actually, this is produced because people are being harmed and people are
Mm,
being hurt and people are being threatened, right? And people are desperate, and women, not people, women are desperate and women are being harmed. I mean, actually, it was going on to some men as well, as it happens, but a minority. 99% of pornography is heterosexual pornography. Let's not. And it's men doing things to women or harming them in some ways. And you know what? They actually just described what was going on in pornography. And everyone rejected that, and they sanitized it. And they said, that's not going on in pornography. This is going on. Everyone is having fun. It's equal. There's consent, blah, blah, blah. So that's their understanding of pornography has really influenced my worldview. And again, this is literature I had to read outside of my academic life because inside the academy, there are not these critical perspectives. So, for
mm,
example, attachment theory is very marginalized and not widely discussed, unless the only version of attachment theory that's discussed in academia is when it can be applied to people becoming attached to objects. And in that sense, it stops being attachment theory and it starts being an arm of advertising and marketing. But yeah, so you might have come across terms like people feeling attached to their mobile phones or they're attached to their dolls or whatever. They're drawing on, if you like, the vocabulary of attachment theory, but they're actually ignoring its underlying idea, which is about relationships between people. The second thing is about what why I don't call sex robots anymore, why I call them pornography. So I see them as porn robots. And we've got to remember pornography, if we go back to the ancient Greece, the citizen society, the male society where they had slaves, they basically raped women and children. They passed it off as sex because the men had the power, so the citizen males had the power. They even raped other men. They could decide what sex was, what love was. They had the power to name things, to choose what things were. And they had special places where they housed people who they wanted to rape, called brothels. And we still have those today where men can go and rape women basically for money. It's not consensual, it's not mutual. It's an asymmetrical practice. Now, with sex and there's a number of reasons why I don't call them sex robots. Because if we go back to the brothel in ancient Greece, now they produced all this pornography on pots. So after, they couldn't film what was going on at the time, right, in the brothel. So they had artists create images of what went on in brothels and put those images on pots. And sometimes they would embellish the images with all these fictional ideas about gods and goddesses and, natural entities. But that's how they represented the pornography. And over time, human society got more sophisticated how it could represent things. And until it got to the point where it could represent things going on in the moment that it was going on, right? Or it could film something and then save it and then transfer it somewhere. So it could be viewed at different times and different locations. Or it could be live streamed as we have today. So you have live stream pornography. So what you always have with pornography is someone being degraded. So sometimes that degradation is projected onto the surfaces of pottery. Sometimes it's projected on two-dimensional surfaces in terms of art. Sometimes it's reflected in words. Sometimes it's symbolized through numbers that can become binary code that can be expressed on surfaces in terms of representational technological images. And sometimes it's on the surface of silicon. So, what a porn doll is, it's really a pornographic image of woman on the surface, on a three-dimensional surface. So, it's a three-dimensional porn, which now men can buy, use alongside their other forms of pornography. Another reason why I don't call them sex robots is I don't believe that in this idea that human beings have this split off world of sex and sexuality as if it's a thing that can exist in and of itself. Now, only a world created where relationship between people isn't prioritized could there even be a split off world described and discussed. So there is no there is no part of a being that's sex and sexuality, right, that exists autonomously outside of people. But there is processes of abuse between people that can be, if you like, marketed as this autonomous process. So, the woman in the film, in the pornographic film, it's not like the woman turns up and she goes, right, I'm going to leave behind myself and I'm going to turn up on set and I'm going to be abused by all these men. And then after the abuse is over, I'm going to recover myself and be myself again and walk out the door and carry on my shopping. That experience is still with her, but society is telling us it's not with her. She's actually managed to compartmentalize that experience inside of herself and pass it off as this autonomous thing. That's not true. It's actually happened to her body, which is why women who go into pornography stay in it for such a short period, why they have long lasting trauma and other mental health issues, why they have physical concerns, because these things aren't something that are left at these, the events that happen, the actions that take place on their bodies can't be just left at the door while they enter this compartmentalized world of porn and then re-enter their own bodies. So we've created a number of fictions, haven't we, to speak
Mm.
about sex and sexuality that actually are fictions. They don't actually make sense when you really think about people and their lives and how they live their lives and how they have their relationships with each other. So while porn robots are pornography and not sex, they can never be sex at all because one, you can't have sex by yourself, right? You've got to have sex is between I and you. Sex is also, I reserve sex as in sexual intercourse. So I think about the word intercourse meaning between, inter. So it
Mm.
has to have participant, it has to have an other. It can't be something autonomous and split off. But
Mm.
I think we live in a world where we're being told that everything can become split off. And then we have, so in my own work, I call this the politics of dissociation, how we create these dissociative systems. We need to support them through fictions. Without fictions, they can't exist. And the way to, yeah. So, yeah, not sex, not sexuality. There's no split off parts. And these are definitely, there's nothing sexual going on with the, well, there is something sexual. I mean, the men who use them are imitating something. They are imitating, they're not actually abusing the dolls, right? You can't abuse an object, but they are imitating a form of abuse that they are seeing when they're viewing pornography of women being abused or children being abused. So they're imitating a form of sexual abuse. but they are not, the object itself is not being abused. And actually, and this is really important, I want to get this in. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer.
Oh, that's
There's
great.
this whole Aristotelian fiction going that somehow, I mean, this was a man who was pro-slavery,
Mhm.
right? He won, right? How he's become a central figure to talk about the ethics of anything today is beyond me. But anyway, so here in Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about all these what men must do in order that they must look good, right? And so the idea is that if you produce an object in the form of a child, for example, say, because child abuse is illegal, therefore, in order to use it in a particular kind of way, i.e., for rapey purposes, then that reflects badly on your character because in the wider, so we want to like stop people using particular kinds of objects, but have other ones. It's totally fine. So if, for example, an adult wants an adult porn robot and they want to marry it and swear undying love, then that's great because then that's not harmful. No one's being harmed. The doll's not being harmed. They're not being harmed. In fact, they're trying to act out something meaningful in society like a marriage.
Mm,
No, no, no. The reason it actually doesn't really, the fact that we're having this conversation about representational objects, technologies in our world, right, doesn't actually demonstrate anything good or bad about human beings. Because we know, right, we've got masses and masses of evidence that children are being raped,
mm,
women are being murdered, right? Women are being abused in pornography. Animals are being tortured and raped in pornography. I mean, these things are actually happening. And everyone's saying, oh, let's not talk about the pornography, even though we've got all this evidence of all this abuse. Let's talk about these objects and let's have
mm,
a conversation. I mean, this is part of the dissociation.
mm,
You want to talk about something completely unrelated to it. I mean, to be honest, as I see porn robots as pornographic representations of women and girls, I think to have them in public spaces is like having an issue of Playboy or playing pornography, right, on your phone in public spaces. They should not be in public spaces. However, they're not the origin of this problem. The origin of the problem is what is the vast dehumanizing industry of pornography and prostitution and child abuse, right? Male violence against women, male abuse, male power, and female subordination is what its root of it. And that's a relationship between people. That's a relationship you've got to change. If you want to change the world, you've got to focus on the relationships between people, not the relationships between people and their objects.
mm. Yeah, that there's a lot there to unpack, and
So,
that's no, that's great. You've got my wheels turning, and I think it's interesting you talk about disassociating from the actual reality of hurt and harm, especially with children. And there's been this whole debacle with Pornhub and other places where there's no consent from the people who are actually being captured in the film. There's been instances of rape that have, people have said, this is me being harmed on film, and Pornhub
they've
refused.
always said that. They've
Yes,
actually, women have always been saying this.
yes.
I'm
Hmm.
being raped on film. That wasn't supposed to be seen because
Hmm.
our intimate life. It's not like it suddenly started happening, but people, you know, in a society where it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And predominantly men have more economic, social power in our world, and they are the stronger sex, right? This means that they can enforce, if you like, because it's not happening to them. Men aren't watching videos of other men being raped, right, and sexually abused. They're watching people who are more vulnerable than themselves being abused. And that's what's exciting about it to them. And so, coming back to what I said earlier about love and vulnerability, what kind of world is that when someone's vulnerabilities becomes a source, someone harming someone who is vulnerable becomes a source of men's pleasure.
Mm.
What kind of world is that?
It's a world we live in for sure. It's
I'm
the
not
world.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying all men, but I'm saying viewing pornography, then if you view pornography, if you use pornography, you're participating in it. You're participating in using someone else's pain as entertainment, right? I used to be pro pornography myself, right? I mean, this is where it gets tricky because so many men and more women than, say, 40 years ago when Dworkin and McKinnon were around watch pornography. And it's everywhere. It's like it's embedded in all our TV, pornographic messages, if you like, and genres are embedded in our TV programs, our dramas, fashion world. Even pedophilia now we can see is creeping into the fashion world and, the kind of even in toys, there was that case, I think it was a couple of years ago, where was it one of the dolls, Bratz dolls or something? I can't
Yes.
was it the Bratz doll and you put them in water and they had stocking and suspenders on? These were
Mhm.
targeted at little girls. So we've got pedophilic messages now disseminated widely, and we know what's going on to children now is, I mean, it's horrific, and we don't want to have those conversations because what happens in dissociation is you want to create a fiction that's, it's kind of a pleasurable fiction because the reality is too uncomfortable. But we really need to be thinking about ways in which maybe even this conversation is going to be too much for your listeners, right? So thinking about ways in which we can speak about reality. But I think if people really care about these issues, then they have to take a stand against pornography and
Mm.
prostitution.
Yeah, I think it's such a big topic for people, and especially people in faith communities where even in our own denomination, there's been this big turmoil over children that were raped and harmed
Yeah,
inside of church entities, and nothing was done about it because there's this sense of live and let live, or we are in theological language all sinful. So therefore, it is like you're saying, this natural consequence of our nature. Therefore, we can't really judge them. Therefore, we can't punish it. But I don't believe that to be true, Kathleen. I believe that love demands justice. And if we're going to love and be in these relationships with one another in the social contract, to be in a healthy civilization, then there has to be some accountability and there has to be some moral restraint as far as what we deem as legal, socially acceptable, and even just the basic things that we know about pornography, which I think is fascinating because in my own research, like you said, I really struggled when I was going through and reading to find somebody who would say something negative about viewing pornography. It's, you're anti-sex positivity, and I'm not at all. And, very pro-sex. And that might be strange to hear from a pastor, but as I deal with this on the trench level and dealing with couples and dealing with people who are not just young, but are dealing with these issues in their 60s and 70s, that sexuality is not something that goes away. It actually gets harder to deal with, and you have less ability to act on that impulse. And it becomes a real struggle for people in their own identity and how they value themselves. And it's very hard for them to accept the fact that I can't enjoy this pleasure anymore. And so what do they do? And how do we deal with that if there's issues within the couple and in the marriage where one person wants something else? Usually the male wants more sex or a particular type of sex, and the female wants something different. It is sexual, but it's very different. And it's just in my own experience. And those two are in a real tension in the world. And so often men, like you say, will go towards different outlets. But the problem is, and this is coming back to what happened in the pandemic, In March 2020, we saw the Pornhub numbers just explode. And so what people were doing in their frustration, in their isolation, was going to some type of sexual outlet. And what I did find through that was people began to say, maybe this is not as positive as we thought it was. And it's actually changing the gray matter in our brain. It's shrinking as we are viewing this object, which we would say is virtual, which we know it's not. It's real. It's really happening to a body somewhere in time and space, but it's actually impacting me. So even though we want to disassociate from it and we want to make it a just a carnal response to something, it's actually not, and it has a lateral effect upon both the person being filmed, abused, whatever you want to label that is, whether you're sex positive or not, and also the person observing it. There is a connection, and more often than not, it's not a healthy one, even though that is the narrative that I've heard over and over and over again. And I think one of the biggest drivers for that conversation is that, well, sex education. And I'm not really sure, just pastorally dealing with this, if I want to say that pornography is an education for people, if that's what they're expecting in real life and what they're expecting as they go through a relationship and commitment to one another. If you just want to see the harm in that, just talk to your local clergy, and we can tell you right away there's real consequences to bringing that into your bedroom and to
Yeah.
believing that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I no, I think this way. I mean, before there was, if you like, male dominance and female subordination that was institutionalized through the law, through religion, through education, through politics. But the actual and there's always been this kind of opportunity for some men to access prostituted women in different ways. But it's mainly been the domain of the rich. I mean, they're the ones that have had the sex parties, the clubs, the brothels, because they had the resources to create them. And then what happened when you were able to mass produce pornography is it basically gives every man viewing it the kind of power that was once the privilege of the slaver, right, in
Mhm,
ancient Greece, because only he would have this power. And now it's giving all these ordinary men power. And then these ordinary men have women in their lives. And as Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin says, then they look at something in 2 dimensions, and then they've got a 3 dimensional human being they can try it out on. And obviously, women are not pornography, right? They don't
mhm,
like to be related to as though they're objects. And there's that natural. And I mean, I would tell you those wives to leave if their husbands watch pornography on them. But I know that's not simple to leave these
mhm,
relationships. But I guess it's a challenge for me too, because I'm coming at this from a secular point of view. And because the overwhelming narrative in our world, even in academic circles, is to endorse and promote pornography and prostitution, to sanitize what goes on in it, to discredit this idea that it's harmful, to problematize. They've even kind of selectively focused on stories about upskirting or deepfakes if it affects them, while ignoring the mass of women. Most of them are poor and indigenous and women of color or women with complex emotional needs, ignoring the masses who are kind of used as in pornography. I just think academia has a lot to answer for, to be honest. And as someone like me who, as I said, I was totally immersed in that world of being pro pornography. I was surrounded by people, even left wing people who are meant to be the liberators of humanity, saying that pornography was great and that women were choosing to do it. And it was just like, it was as bad as working as a cleaner.
mm,
Looking back now, I think is absolutely outrageous, which is why I can't support those kind of politics anymore. I'm unable to support it. And actually, you see, whereas to take, you don't actually need to have any intellectual outlook on pornography. All you need to do is actually look at what's happening and then think about what it must be really like to be in that situation, and then read the testimonies of survivors from prostitution and pornography to gain an insight. Now, some of those stories will be, oh yeah, it was fantastic, I had so much power, but most of them won't be. There will be stories about women who were abused as children, who became homeless, who
mm,
had other kinds of issues, who suffered racial discrimination. Those are the stories you're going to read. And then after that, if you still feel that you can masturbate to those kind of images, I mean, I don't think it's actually there's a feminist called Gail Dines who's written a lot about pornography, and she says it's not one big conversation, but it's a million little conversations. And I think you've got to remember this is a powerful global industry that's institutionalized its practices. It's Goliath. And how
mm,
do you defeat Goliath, right? You have to come up with a very clever way of doing it.
mm,
I would also say to your parishioners as well, for people who want to disengage with pornography, is to perhaps read some of this stuff about childhood trauma.
mm,
Because, coming back to the issue of vulnerability again, if people are being aroused by other people, if you like, harming other people when they are vulnerable, particularly children or young people, if that's what's going on, then that tells us something about that human being and perhaps their own relationships and their own lives. And so I think, especially Christians, not all the time, but just people, they have a practice, don't they, of trying to be good and trying to be kind and
mm.
trying to be loving. But there's not, it's not like there's a section in the Bible that's anti-pornography, right? Or
Not
maybe there is.
well, there's definitely sections where Paul talks about the pedestry and that we definitely shouldn't harm children and women, shouldn't put them in
Yeah.
positions
But then
of
there are places where it says, you can harm women. So, I don't think it's gonna work. I mean, obviously there's a complex message
mm,
for religious people with these teachings. So, but I think we've got to develop resources in the here and now.
mm,
So yeah, read testimonies of survivors. That's what I do. If I want to understand something, I try to understand the perspective of the people who've experienced something. Try to think about the context of it. Try to think about one's own life, right? I mean, why do we find it difficult as human beings to be with each other when we're vulnerable?
yeah, I think it's a crash course in empathy to listen to the stories of women, children, and men who have been through desperate situations. And we even
Yeah.
looked to those of us in the US there, we look at Skid Row, and you see so many people who fall into those addictions and even the attachment to quick money, and whatever type of sex industry that they're a part of. And you do hear those stories over and over again that it becomes something that we couldn't get outside of, and we got attached to that quick money, and now it became a master over them. And so we definitely need to listen first, I think. And Kathleen, your research, I think, is a step towards that empathy and helping people and being vulnerable and loving them and being kind and seeing them for what they really are as not an object, but a human and a valuable human. And so, Kathleen, tell us a little bit more about your work that you want to promote and where people can find you if they have more questions about your research and your ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Me and my colleague Charlotta have just done an edited volume about sex dolls and sex robots. It's called that because we had a democratic decision about what the title of the book should be called. But in there, you will find my chapter, which is actually called The End of Sex Robots. And I make a case for why we should stop referring to them in these ways. I think it's also very important that we stop referring to them as sex robots, because when we realize they are pornography, they are printed forms of pornography, then that gives policymakers some anchor to think about how they might regulate them in wider society. At the moment, there's nothing stopping men bringing their porn dolls into on. I mean, I've heard stories. There was an interview of a man who took his porn doll down to the breakfast table with his children and then
Mm.
put the porn doll in the car and took it on the school run. So you can see that this is men's sexual fetish. This form of pornography is part of their fetishistic practices, and so they are basically forcing fetish on other people by presenting these objects in public spaces. So I think policymakers have a case there to regulate them. I think they're forms of pornography. I'm ultimately aiming for the abolition of pornography, which I do not regard as a relational sexual practice. So read that book. You can find it. It is very expensive, but if you're at a university, perhaps you can get your college or university to download it. I'm also happy to come and do talks. I love America. I think it's a really fantastic place. So if anyone wants me to come and give a talk, I'd be quite happy to. And then I've also got a monograph, which I keep rewriting and keep rewriting. It's almost like when you're dealing with a question of love and relationship, it's a really challenging topic. And you've got to, it's almost like I've been finding ways of where to put everything. And I feel like the process is nearly coming to an end. So hopefully, if not this year, then next year that will be out there, because I'm trying to formulate things that I've talked about with you into a framework that I can share and share with others. And hopefully, when I give, maybe some will receive it in a
Mm.
way that it is intended to be given.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, so much for your time today. And I'm just grateful that you were able to come on and share your perspective on this much needed topic of discussion as we
Thank
talk about pornography and robots and AI. It's not going anywhere. But
you. We talked about love.
yes, and love. That is a key conversation that is missing. And so I'm grateful. I'd encourage anybody to reach out to her if you needed someone to speak on these issues. A very brave voice, Kathleen, and I appreciate your heart in your writing and also in your speaking.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Well, that wraps up today's episode, and just want to encourage you to subscribe and like this episode. Leave us a review if you want to see more content produced like this, and make sure to follow our guests and to reach out to them and say thank you for all that they've done. Thanks. This is Joshua Smith, and you've been listening to the Dolores Project.